let's talk about percents, fractions, and decimals. We begin by looking at the word percent. Percent comes from percentum, Latin phrase meaning for every 100. Anyone who speaks any of the Romance languages, Spanish, Italian, you may recognize that as por cien, for every 100. That's what percent means. Percent means out of every 100. Let's give it a little bit more formal of a definition. We'll go and write that separately here as a definition. Definition. X percent, where X is just some number, 5%, 10%, 24%. X percent means X out of 100. Or in other words, the fraction X over 100. Okay. So as was just mentioned, examples of that are 5%. Well, that's the same as saying 5 out of 100. So 5% equals 5 over 100. 12% would equal to 12 over 100. And you can go over 100%. It just means that your numerator is bigger than the denominator. It's an improper fraction, but there's nothing wrong with that. You can say something like 110%. You see in every sports movie, you're going to give 110%. That just means you're giving 110 out of 100. And any number bigger than that is fine as well. You can give 216%. That team's definitely going to win. That's a lot bigger than that, yeah? And that would just be 216 over 100. Yeah? Now, percents are useful because they are a simple way to discern how much of something you have. It's pretty easy to get. The smaller the number, the smaller you have. 5% is less than 12%, which is less than 110%. However, percent notation is not particularly useful if you're trying to do some computations. If you're trying to do some math, then the percent notation is not as useful as a fraction or even a decimal. So because of that, it's useful to be able to convert back and forth. If you have a fraction, to write it as a decimal or a percent. If you have a decimal or a percent, to write it as a fraction, and to be able to go back and forth between any of those. So here, let's just talk about those one at a time. Let's say you have a percent, 5%, 12%, any of these will be fine. And what you want to do is you want to convert this to a fraction. You say, well, isn't that what you just did over here? Well, yeah, that is what I did over here. But there is a little bit more we need to do. So here we're going to talk about percent to fraction. Because here we're halfway done. 5% is 5 over 100, that's a fraction. And 12% is 12 over 100, that's a fraction. All of these are fractions. However, whenever you have a fraction written, you generally want to write it in lowest terms. After all, we're going to be doing computations with these things. We're going to be adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. And if you can make the number smaller, everything's going to be simpler as we go through it. Right? So when you write something as a fraction, okay, we have the fraction, but then we have to reduce it. So whenever you have a fraction, you want to write in lowest terms. So reduce to lowest terms. So for example, let's say you have 5%. Okay, well 5% is 5 over 100. But now let's reduce that. After all, the numerator and the denominator can both be divided by the number 5. Right? Here, we can write this as, there's a couple ways you could reduce fractions. One is you can say, okay, let me divide 5 by 5, and that gives me 1. Let me divide 100 by 5, and that gives me 20. That's useful. However, every once in a while, you might accidentally divide by something that's not quite big enough. You might have a number that's a lot bigger, and you might divide by something that's not as big as you need. So here, let me go ahead and do it a slightly different way. I'm going to go ahead and factor this out here. 5 is 1 times 5. And 100, that's 2 times 50. Well, yeah, but 50 is 2 times 25. And 25 is 5 times 5. If you notice now, these 5s divide away. And what's left? Well, my numerator is the number 1. And my denominator, 2 times 2 is 4, times 5 is 20. Now you might say, well, what if I just went ahead and divided by 5 on top and bottom? Well, that's fine. As long as you know that that's the right number to divide by, then that's all you need to do. Let's see another example. Let me go ahead and just use the next one, 12%. 12% is equal to 12 over 100. Again, if you know what number to divide by, then just go ahead and divide and you're done. However, sometimes you might not divide by a number that's big enough. For example, here you might say, oh, look, the numerator and the denominator can both be divided by 2 because they're both even. And that's right. I can divide 12 by 2 and that'll give me 6. And I divide 100 by 2 and that'll give me 50. However, that's not the biggest number I can divide into both of those. After all, 12 is 2 times 6. Oh yeah, well 6 is 2 times 3, yeah? All right, 2 times 2 is 4, times 3 is 12. 100, well we already know that's 2 times 2 times 5 times 5. And you notice here, yeah, the 2's divide away, but then so do these. So both of those divide out. So in the end, you're left with 3 over 25. So it looks like the number you were dividing by was 4. 12 divided by 4 is 3, and 100 divided by 4 is 25. Again, if you already know that's the right number to divide by, you don't have to do this. You can go directly to the division. But if you're not certain, if you have the right number, factoring it out is a simpler way to be able to see, hey look, those divide out, and so do those. If there's one on the numerator and one on the denominator, one on top and one on bottom, those divide out, and whatever's left is your result. Right? Now, keep in mind, not everything will reduce. For example, if we had 17%, well, if we write that as a fraction, that's going to be 17 over 100. But then when we try to reduce that, we realize that just doesn't happen. 17 and 100 don't have any common factors. After all, 17, the only number that divides 17 is 17. 1 times 17 is the only way for me to get 17. I can't have 2 times 2 times 3 or anything like that I had before. 100, again, we know that's 2 times 2 times 5 times 5. And you notice that nothing actually divides out. Oh, okay, so if nothing divides out, that means that this was already in lowest terms to begin with. So here, that's our result. So go ahead and give this a try. Go ahead and try 24%. Okay, go ahead and pause the video right now and give this a try. Write this as a fraction. Make sure you reduce the lowest terms. And once you have the right answer, go ahead and unpause and we'll go and confirm it together. All right, so let's give this one a try. 24%, that's equal to 24 over 100. Now, if you already can see what the right number to divide by is, just go ahead and do that and you're done. But if not, well, let's see. 100 is 2 times 2 is 5 and 5. All right, that's 25 times 2 is 50 times 2 more is 100. 24 is 2 times 12. Well, yeah, but 12 is 2 times 6. Now, 6 is 2 times 3. And right here, you'll note that, similar to this one, you have these 2's divide out, and also these 2's divide out. So what's left? Well, let's see. You have 2 times 3. It's going to give us 6. And 5 times 5 is 25. So 24% is 6 over 25 as a fraction. That's the simplest fraction that means the same thing as 24%. All right. Now, what if we don't want to use a fraction? What if we want to use a decimal instead? Oftentimes, if we're talking about money, decimals are more natural. We can talk about 17 cents much more easily than we can talk about 17/100ths of a dollar. All right? Decimals are often used, especially with money, but in other circumstances as well. So let's talk about that next. What happens if we want to take a percent and change it not to a fraction, but to a decimal? All right, well, it turns out you start off the same way. Because after all, percent means out of 100. What do you mean by that? Well, let's do the same ones. Let's say 5%. 5% means 5 out of 100. At this point, you say, well, wait a minute. I thought you wanted a decimal. Why'd you go to a fraction? Because fractions can be converted to decimals by just dividing. If we take 5 and divide by 100, The answer is our decimal. So 5 divided by 100, that's 0.05. You say, how'd you get that so quickly? Don't you want to do the division? Well, anytime you divide by a number, generally you do the long division. However, 10, 100, 1,000, those are special. Whenever you divide by 10, what happens is you take the decimal, here in the number 5, it's right at the end, it's like 5.0, no? And you move it one space to the left. If you multiply by 100, if you divide by 100, you would move it 2 spaces to the left. 1,000 would be 1, 2, 3 spaces to the left. However many zeros you have, that's how many spaces you're going to move it over. So here, the 5.0, move it over, that's 2 zeros, so that's 2 spaces, 1, 2, that's 0.05. Yeah, 0.05. If you want to skip this part, you can jump directly to this, because essentially all you're saying is that number is being divided by 100. You don't actually have to write that, as long as you remember that's what it means. Divide by 100, oh, I move my decimal 2 spaces, and I have my result. If I have 12%, that's going to be 12 over 100. And again, you don't have to write that. If you just remember that's what it means, then you'll be able to say, oh, well then all I have to do is move my decimal over 2 spaces, which gives me 0.12. And of course, you can have numbers that are over 100. We have something like 216%. 216%, that's 216 over 100. And again, dividing by 100, take your decimal, that's all the way at the end here, 216.0, and you would move it over 2 spaces to the left. Notice that doesn't bring you all the way to the front of the number. It puts you right here between the 2 and the 1. So this would be 2.16, 2 and 16 hundredths. And there we go. One thing to note here is this is just a notation kind of thing. Some people write 0.12. Other people write 0.12. Kind of reminiscent to money. Some people say it's 12 cents, and other people say it's $0.12. We're not going to make that distinction in this class. It means the same thing. So either one is fine. If you write your answer as 0.05, that is perfectly fine. If you write it as 0.05, that is also perfectly fine. It makes no difference. It means the same thing. So either one is fine, whichever one you prefer. Note that when you're converting a percent to a decimal, essentially what you're doing is you're taking the decimal from the right part of the number, from the right side, and moving it to the left 2 spaces. Well, what if I wanted to go backwards? What if instead of going from a percent to a decimal, I wanted to start with a decimal and go back to a percent? Well, then I would just reverse the process. Instead of starting with the decimal on this side and moving to the left, I will start with the decimal on this side and move it to the right, going back in the other direction. So let's take a look at how to do that. Let's say we have a decimal to begin with and we want to write that as a percent. For example, let's say you have 0.72. Let's write that as a percent. Well, whenever you have a percent, you start with the decimal from the right and move it to the left 2 spaces. To go the other way around, you start from the decimal on the left and move it to the right 2 spaces. So here's your decimal on the left, move it to the right 2 spaces. So that brings it all the way to this side, which is just 72. If you want to write 72.0, you can, but everyone pretty much just writes 72. Now remember, this is a percent. You don't just write 72. It is 72%. After all, 72 is not the same as 0.72. Right? $72 is not the same as 72 cents. Rather, 0.72 is equal to 72%. Or in other words, if you want to talk about money, 72 cents is equal to 72 pennies out of my whole dollar, out of my 100 pennies. Remember, you can have a number that's greater than 100%. For example, if I have 1.53, then again, I would have my decimal and I would have to move it over to the right 2 spaces. So I will put it right here and that will give me 153%. If you happen to have a number that doesn't have enough spaces here, you can always just fill it in with a 0. For example, if I have 1.3 and I want to change that decimal into a percent, I would take this decimal and move it over to the left 2 spaces. You say, well, there's only one number here, to the right 2 spaces. You say there's only one number to the right. Well, yeah, but you can fill it in with another 0, like that. And however many zeros you need, you can always fill them in. So here you only need one more 0 here. That way you can go 1, 2 spaces over, and that's 130%. And in fact, even if you don't have any decimals at all, for example, the number 3. If you want to change that to a percent, well, number 3 is like saying 3.0. That's the same as saying 3.00. Right? $3 is the same as $3.00. And to convert to a percent, I want to take this decimal and move 2 spaces to the right, which brings it right to the end over here, and I end up with 300. I end up with 300%. Just like that. So go ahead and give this a try. Go ahead and pause the video for a moment and convert the decimal 2.4. Go ahead and convert that to a percent. Once you're done, go ahead and unpause the video and we'll go through it together. Alright, so you want to go ahead and move the decimal over to the right 2 spaces. You might note there's not 2 numbers after the decimal, so we can always fill it in. So 2.4 is the same as 2.40. That's the same thing. And now we can move the decimal over 2 spaces to give us 240%. Just like that. Finally, the last one, we saw how to go from decimals to percents and how to go from percents to decimals. Here we see how to go from percents to fractions. So now the last one, how do you go from fractions back to percents? You say, why'd you leave such a big space there? Because there's a middle step here. Converting from a fraction to a percent is most easily done if we take that fraction and turn it into a decimal first. Once it's a decimal, then we already know how to do that, how to convert from that decimal to a percent. So from a fraction to a percent, we don't usually jump directly. Usually we say we're going to go from a fraction to a decimal, and then that decimal we change to a percent. The exception, of course, being if your fraction is already out of 100. If, for example, you have the fraction 7 over 100, then you wouldn't change that to a decimal. That already fits the definition that we had. After all, if some number over 100 means that number percent, well then right here, 7 over 100, that means 7%. So if your fraction is already over 100, you would just leave it. You say 7 over 100, that's 7%. However, with most numbers, the simplest thing to do is to convert it to a decimal and then to a percent. So let's say we have 3/8. Let's take 3/8 and convert that to a percent. All right, well, we're not going to jump directly to a percent. We're going to start off by writing it as a decimal. And to write a fraction as a decimal, you complete the division. So here we're going to take the number 3, and we're going to divide that by the number 8. The numerator goes inside, but the denominator goes on the outside. Now, you might note that you can't divide 3 by 8. 8's too big. Oh yeah, but we can always add some more zeros here. So 3, instead of writing that as 3, we're going to write it as 3.0. And now we're going to say, okay, 8 doesn't go into 3. It does go into 30, though. 8 goes into 30 3 times. 8 times 3 is 24. 8 times 4 would be 32. That's too big. But 8 times 3 is 24. And I subtract, and that'll give me 6. Okay, well, there's a remainder. Oh, okay, well, that means we can keep going. After all, 3 is the same as 3.0. That's the same as 3.00. We can keep going as long as we need to. Let's bring down that 0. 8 goes into 67 times. 8 would be too big. 8 times 8 is 64. So 8 times 7, that's 56. We'll subtract that. That gives us 4. Okay, we still have a remainder. Let's keep going. Let's put another 0. Drop it down. 8 goes into 45 times. 8 times 5 is 40. Now we don't have a remainder. Now we're done. So we'll take this decimal, pick it straight up, and there we go. 3 divided by 8, 3/8 is the same as 0.375. Okay, well, now that it's a decimal, converting to a percent is just a matter of taking the decimal and moving it over to the right. Remember, 2 spaces every time. Here, it won't go all the way to the end, but that's okay. No one ever said it had to. So we take this and slide over 2 spaces. That'll give you 37.5. And that's your percent. 37.5%. If your fraction already is over 100, well then, you're done. 7 over 100 is 7%. Otherwise, the simplest thing to do is you convert to a decimal, and then that decimal is easy to turn into a percent. Right, let's see that one more time. Let's take 7/4. And again, let's go and convert that into a percent. 7/4, well, let's go and do the division. Take your numerator that's inside, denominator that's on the outside. 7 divided by 4. 4 goes into 7 one time. 1 times 4 is 4. Subtract gives us 3. And we don't want a remainder, so let's keep going. Let's go ahead and drop a 0. 4 goes into 30. Oh, let's see, is that 7 times. 8 times 4 would be 32. That's too big. So 7 times 4 is 28. It gives us 2. Okay, and when we still have a remainder, let's do that again. Drop another 0. 4 goes into 25 times. 5 times 4 is 20. And then our remainder is 0. Once your remainder is 0, that means you're done dividing. You take your decimal and pick it straight up. So that's 1.75. So now, to convert this to a percent is a matter of just moving the decimal over. Take this decimal, move to the right 2 spaces, and that puts it all the way at the end, which gives us 175%. Right? So go ahead and give this a try. Let's be mean about it. Let's give a slightly bigger number here. Let's go with 7/16. 7/16. Let's go ahead and convert 7/16 into a percent. Go ahead and give that a try. Pause the video. And once you have a result, go ahead and unpause and we'll go through it together. All right, so let's go through this. We begin by changing the fraction into a decimal, and that's done by dividing. Take your numerator, divide that by your denominator, divide by 16, and here we go. 16 doesn't go into 7, so we're going to need to put some decimals over here. All right, so 16 goes into 70. It's going to be 4 times. 5 times would be 80, right? 5 times 16 would be 80. That's too big. 16 times 4, on the other hand, is 64. And when we subtract those, 70 minus 64, we ignore the decimal until the end. That's going to give us 6. Okay, well, there's a remainder, which means we want to keep going. Let's drop another 0. 16 goes into 60. Well, we already know that 4 times 16 is 64. That would be too big. So we want to use 3. 16 times 3, that's 48. And if you take 60 minus 48, we end up with 12. Okay? Well, again, we still have a remainder, so we got to keep going. Let's put a 0 and bring that down. Let's see here. 16 goes into 120. That would be 7. Right? Because 8 would be 8 times 16, that's 128. That's just a little too big. So 7 works. 7 times 16, that's going to give us 112. And when we subtract that, that's going to be 8. And again, we still have a remainder. We keep going. You keep going until either your number starts to repeat or until you have no remainder. So here we go. If we look at this, we have 16 goes into, oh, I forgot to drop my 0. 16 goes into 80. Oh, that does work evenly because 5 times 16 will be 80, and now we don't have a remainder. So that's it. So 7 over 16, we want to convert that to a decimal. That's 0.4375. And now we can convert that into a percent by taking that decimal on the front and moving it over to the right 2 spaces. That goes 43.75. And that is our percent. All right, there is one last example that we want to look at here. It's still the same concept of turning a fraction into a percent, but it looks just a little bit different at the end. So one last example. Oh, let's see here. Let's say 5/6. Let's go and convert that into a percent. Now, it's going to look very much the same way. We're going to start by turning it into a decimal. The difference is that while these decimals all end with no remainder eventually, this one does not. So let's go ahead and do the division here. If we take 5 and divide it by 6, well, again, 6 doesn't go into 5, but we can go ahead and put a decimal out here. There we go. 6 goes into 50 8 times, because 6 times 8 is 48. And we subtract, and that gives us 2. And drop a 0. Okay, well, 6 goes into 23 times. Because after all, 3 times 6 is 18. And when we subtract that, that gives us the number 2. Okay, well, there's still a remainder, so we do it again. Okay, so then 6 goes into 20 3 times. And 3 times 6 is 18. And we subtract, and well, that's 2. And do it again. And you notice what's going to happen. It's going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. 20 minus 18, 20 minus 18, 20, so forth and so on. Yeah. So when we convert this into a decimal, what we get is, well, a non-terminating decimal. It's called a repeating decimal. A decimal that never ends because the number just keeps repeating over and over again. So how do we do that? How do we write that as a percent? Well, there's 2 ways to do it. One way to do it is to simply cut it off after a little bit and say like this. We're going to write this as 0.83 with a bar on top. You say a bar? Yeah. What's the bar mean? The bar means that that number is the one that's going to repeat forever. So if we had 0.835 and there was a bar over the 3 and the 5, it would be 0.835353535. But if we had 0.835 and just had the bar over the 5, not the 3, then it would be 8355555. The numbers that have the bar over them, those are the ones that repeat. So by putting the bar over the 3, that means you have 0.8, and then the 3 repeats forever. Now here, what I want to do is I actually want to do one more 3 here, because I need 2 of these decimals. I need 2 spaces to get my decimal written correctly. So I'm going to write that as 0.833 bar. These mean the same thing, by the way. Here, the 3 repeats forever, and here the 3 repeats forever. But here, since I want to move the decimal over 2 spaces, I want to have 2 spaces clear without a bar so that I can actually write that. So they mean the same thing, but this is the way I want to write it. And now, I can convert from this into a percent. Move my decimal 2 spaces. That's that's 83.3. Move the decimal 2 spaces, and now that 3 has a bar over it. So what this means is 83.33333333%. Okay. The other option is we actually can write a mixed number. We usually don't, but it's possible to do so. There's nothing wrong with that. Usually, if we're converting into a decimal, we just go outright and just convert to a decimal completely. However, if you really, really wanted to, you could do this. You could say, well, let's see, 0.33333333. That's the same as a third, isn't it? So here, you could write this as 83 1/3%. Generally speaking, this is probably the way we want to go about writing it. Mostly because if we went through the trouble of converting it into a percent, if we went through the trouble of converting it to a decimal, we just leave everything as a decimal. We don't want to be converting back into fractions. But if you want to, this repeating part can be written as a fraction instead. Either one's correct. Okay. So, as your last exercise here, go ahead and give this a try. Here's one that is repeating. Convert 11/12 into a percent. And again, either of these is fine, but this will probably be the simpler one. So go ahead and pause the video, and once you have a result, go ahead and unpause, and we'll finish off this together. All right, so here we go. We're going to take 11 and divide by 12. Well, 12 doesn't go into 11, so we need a decimal here. 12 goes into 110 9 times. 9 times 12, that's 108. And when we subtract, that gives us 2. We put a 0 here. 12 goes into 20 only once. Okay, 1 times 12 is 12. And when you subtract that, that gives you 8. It looks like I'm running out of space here. Let's try that again here. Let's see, 12 goes into 80, that'll be 6 times. 6 times 12 is 72. And when you subtract that, that gives you 8. And you'll drop a 0, and notice that's going to keep happening. Because now, there's an 80. 12 goes into 80 6 times. 6 times 12 is 72. 80 minus 72 is 8. And that's going to keep happening over and over and over again. So here, 11 over 12 is the same as 0.916666 on forever. Notice I have at least 2 numbers before the repeating part. That way I can turn it into a percent by moving this over 2 spaces. And this will give me, again, 2 spaces to the right. That's going to be 91 point, and then the 6 repeats forever. That's 91.6666666%. 33333 on forever is 1/3. So 6666 on forever is double that. Well, that'll be 2/3. So if you really, really want to, you can convert that into a mixed number. You can write that as 91 2/3%. But again, this suffices and is usually the one we want to go with. So that is it for this topic. If anybody has any questions, comments, or problems, please let me know. And I hope everyone has a nice day.